We first went to Israel in 1979 and then back to Israel and Egypt in 1984. So I'm going to start with our 1984 trip to Egypt and combine the two Israeli trips in this description. During 1984, I had traveled extensively. In fact, I know I was gone 123 nights because I had that many Holiday Inn points. That year, Holiday Inn started a contest, and if you had 60 points, that you could get a free ticket to any Holiday Inn in the world. And that was a very easy task for me because the Holiday Inn at Weirton was always the place I stayed, and then the other places in California and Texas and so forth where I had to travel, I made sure I stayed at the Holiday Inns. And during that year, I'd accumulated 123 points, enough for trips for both of us twice that year. So when I accumulated the 60 points, Shirley and I decided to go to Egypt. We had always been interested in Egypt, and it seemed like the ideal place. And I thought, well, as long as we're in Egypt, we can go back to Israel, where we'd been in 1979. So I talked to the Holiday Inn people and asked them if they would extend the return trip to an additional 7 days without costing them. All they had to do was change the ticket. And they refused. So we left Kalamazoo with full intents of returning in a week. We had to lay over in New York. So while we were sitting there waiting for the intercontinental flight, I decided to go up to the clerk and ask the American Airlines clerk if they would change the departure date on my ticket. And they agreed. There wasn't any issue, so they changed the ticket there for a week later departure from Cairo. So I thought what we could do after we were in Egypt a few days was take a bus up to Israel and stay there a few days and then return on the bus. I didn't realize how long a trip that was when I did that. We landed at Cairo airport, and if you've ever been in Egypt, you know that it's not the example of high efficiency and cleanliness. But we had rooms at the Holiday Inn near the pyramids, and so I wasn't concerned about what I could see at the airport. But anyway, we got through the crowds and the paperwork and caught a bus to our hotel. The streets are unbelievably crowded, and the bus is the only way to travel because it seems to have the right of way over man and beast. The bus driver lays on the horn and the Red Sea just parts in front of it. Cabs or private vehicles are out of luck. That's all there is to it. And it's very economical to ride the bus, so at least in the years that we were there, it was certainly the way to move around the city. The doors on the buses had been removed, and along the outside of the bus from the top to the bottom of the opening, the pipe welded to the bus side. And as the bus moved along, and it didn't move very fast, even in the best of conditions, and the buses were very shaky, to say the least. But it was pretty interesting you just stood along out on the street, and as the bus passed by, you stuck your arm out and grabbed this pipe and swung on board. And conversely, when you get off, you just kind of swung off and did the thing. But anyway, Shirley and I were able to do it, so I guess anybody else could. Actually, it was a pretty efficient system. There was no other system there as far as public transportation is concerned. Like I mentioned earlier, the Red Sea parted when this bus came through, and so I always went up front and watched the spectacle as the bus driver laid on the horn, and the people paid attention. The city is really dirty, just to put it bluntly. The sand flows in from the desert
fills every crack and crevice of streets, and the cars that are parked with the windows down are soon filled interiorly with sand. And there are a lot of broken down cars along the streets that are totally filled right up to the windowsills with sand. The infrastructure was pretty bad. Along many of the sidewalks, large electrical insulated wires, of course, lay on the ground and for long distances at a time, and then would disappear into a large hole right in the sidewalk underground somewhere, and then appear eventually somewhere else down the street. And of course the sand and the dirt in the streets was endemic everywhere. I watched this man work, and finally he looked up at me as if, well, not in exactly friendly way. So I left, but I could see that his work was really skilled. He filed grooves all the way around that large piece of steel to grind coffee beans, and he did it with a hacksaw and a file. I can't imagine doing that by hand. This one day we were walking along the street, and there was a bunch, 4 or 5 young guys standing around the front of this car, and as we walked by I could see that the wheel was off the front right wheel, and they had no jack, so there were 4 or 5 of them were lifting the car, holding the car in the air while the tire was being changed. But people get along the best they can there. There's a lot of vendors and people standing on the sidewalk selling half soles for the shoes, or coat hangers, or some. We met another couple our age from Georgia, and we palled around together for a little while there. He got very sick and had his stomach, and he didn't participate in very much at all. His whole vacation was ruined with a stomach issue, and we were warned not to eat any fresh vegetables or drink any of the water. And so we were scrupulous about what we ate, and we didn't have any trouble. There are so many poor people living there. It's really, really sad. People selling coat hangers on the street, or half soles for the shoes, or other very nominal trinkets. In the center of the city, or near the center, is a huge ancient cemetery filled with elaborate and large monuments, some even resembling small houses. And inside that cemetery perimeter, which is pretty large, a number of acres, that's for sure, I was told that there are about 10,000 people living there. And of course they have no facilities, water or sewer or anything like that. Whatever the cemetery offers is what they get. And of course it's really pretty terrible that they have to live in such circumstances. We were warned not to walk near the Nile River, or on its banks especially. Apparently there's a snail or some kind of a critter living on the banks there that likes human flesh, and the results of the bite is, I'm told, very serious. So of course we didn't go near the river at all during the time we were there. Food is always important, of course, and meat especially, since the lack of refrigeration is pretty widespread. It's usually fresh killed and freshly delivered and freshly purchased. The Giza Pyramid are really an interesting construction, if I can put it that way. We went inside. It was comparatively cool, although it was warm, but it was not uncomfortable. And we went all the way up to the top through those tunnels, and it was an experience, but when the temperatures are really up. We had a good time. We climbed all the way up to the top, and as you can see these pictures here, Shirley standing, although the picture's not very clear because it was so dark in there, and I didn't have a flash with my camera. But nevertheless, Shirley's standing next to Cheops's sarcophagus at the top of the pyramid, inside his chamber room up there where he was buried. This is Shirley and the other wife of the other couple we met at the airport there. Getting on a camel and getting off is pretty tricky. They lie down like this photo shows, with Shirley sitting on the top. But they get up with their hind legs first. And so while they're getting up, you're at before they start working their front legs, you're at about a 45-degree angle downhill. And you have to be ready. You have to have your feet in the stirrups and be braced for it, because you can easily slide off and land on your head in front of the camel. And of course, when they're stopping, they reverse the process. So the front legs drop down, and there you are at 45 degrees angle again. And so somebody told me recently they had a friend that was over there, and she fell off when the camel was getting up and broke her neck, and they had to airlift her from Egypt to wherever it was, and she suffered a severe injury. So, but Shirley loved that. She just loved to do what she's doing right there. The pyramids are were sheathed in granite, and they floated those down from Aswan, 200 or 300 miles up the river, and cut them and sheathed them. But the sheathing is all generally fallen off. Around the top of Cheops Pyramid, it's still hanging on, but essentially it's all off now. And the basalt that the sarcophagus is made from is from the Upper Nile, and it's extremely hard stuff. Numbers of men must have labored for many, many months carving out the inside of that huge block of basalt. And of course, the trick to getting those big stones down the river and up to the pyramid is still shrouded in mystery. We also rented some Arab dress outfits. I mean, when you're in Egypt, you do what you should do in Egypt, and that's look like an Egyptian, I guess. The guy who rode ahead of us, the camel, we were very docile, and I just followed him. So we went on the desert quite a little way, and actually it was a ploy to try to get us to buy perfume, because we circled around and ended up at this little dinky store along the street there, and we went inside. He invited us in for a drink of coffee, so we went along with it and went inside, and his partner in crime there had all these bottles of perfume laid out, and he tried to sell Shirley perfumes, and they weren't cheap either, $15 or $20 for a little bottle of this stuff. And she pretended she couldn't find anything that she liked. Of course, she didn't want to buy that stuff anyway. But they made us feel obligated. But we stood, and I wasn't going to buy it if she didn't want it, and she played along, and she wasn't snookered. So they gave up on it, and we went back out and got on our camels, and when he was getting on, we noticed he was carrying a gun on his waist, so underneath his robes, I guess maybe to prevent robbers from taking whatever earnings he can make. Anyway, we had a good time. Shirley was in her element there. And if you knew Shirley, you can appreciate the truth of that statement. We were there 5 or 6 days. We ate at the various restaurants, Western restaurants. Cairo is a very tourist-oriented place, and there are lots of places to eat, stuff that you're accustomed to. But we decided to go into an Egyptian restaurant for lunch one day. So we went in there and we looked at the menu, and of course it was all in Egyptian. We couldn't understand a word of it. But the waitress, a young little gal, came over, and she asked us in English what we wanted. And we said, well, we didn't know, just bring something. So she brought us each a bowl of something made with rice or something, and it was only 10 cents a bowl. It wasn't bad either, so we ate it, and we didn't suffer any terminal effects from it, but it was sure cheap. We went into the Cairo Museum there, where King Tut is laid out and all this finery. It's an incredible place to go. The gold and the beautiful workmanship from those Egyptians is really difficult to believe that they could do that. But overall, Cairo really is not the prime destination for, in my opinion. Although it's got these wonderful ancient artifacts, there's not much else to recommend it. Anyway, we stayed there and amused ourselves and walked the streets every day, taking in the sights. We stayed there 5 days at the Holiday Inn, and then I had already bought a round-trip bus ticket to Tel Aviv and back. We went to the bus station. We were assigned us 2 seats on this rattly trapped old bus. There were quite a few passengers on it. We had probably a couple of hours of riding, at least, maybe more, on that bus before we got to the edge of the Suez Canal where the crossing was established. So we finally arrived there, and we had to wait, of course. The efficiency of the Egyptians was pretty low, and paperwork was cumbersome and slow and so forth. But anyway, we were sitting on the bus waiting for the ferry to load our bus on its deck. There was a young boy, about 12 or 14 maybe, came on board carrying a container with water and pop and stuff. And so I bought a bottle of water from him. And I paid him $1 or whatever he was asking. And as soon as I got done paying him, he turned around and started to holler about me stealing his water. I refused to pay him, and I was drinking his water, and I didn't pay it. And he was just shouting as loud as he could. He was trying to extort more money out of me. He said that the bottle was $5, and I only gave him one or something. Whatever it was, but he was causing a ruckus there, and I suspect that it's pretty successful. But I'll be darned if I was going to give it to him. Although I was concerned about maybe getting into trouble with those mangy-looking cops standing outside the bus there, but they ignored it. That was his routine, and the bus driver didn't even turn around. As we approached the customs office on the Egyptian side, it was obvious that it hadn't been cleaned or maintained, or the exterior was, the garbage and papers were scattered about, and the soldiers were dressed in really shabby uniforms. The pocket on the shirt of one was torn free and hanging down, and we went into the office there to process our papers and passport, and of course it was slow going, and when we were done I decided I needed to go to the bathroom. So I went inside this bathroom, and I've never, other than the one in Kazakhstan, I never experienced a bathroom so foul. It was a large room, and they had holes in the floor for defecating, and urinal kind of things along one wall that hadn't been cleaned since it was built. And oh gosh, the stench in there was terrible. But the worst part was the way the walls were coated with human feces, and this was done by hand. There were many places where there were handprints remaining in the dried feces on the wall, and this, they must have stood on each other's shoulders to do it, because it reached up maybe 10 feet or more. And what a nightmare. So anyway, we had to ride another 10 minutes maybe to the fence where the Israelis then would put us in one of their buses and take us over to their customs office. And of course their bus was a sleek, air-conditioned, spotless machine. And we approached the blue metal building, very nicely done, with flowers planted around and green grass. Just really a welcoming looking building. It was just a one-story building, and it was nice. And of course, the soldiers were dressed spotlessly, and we got processed in no time. Out of a matter of curiosity, I went into their bathroom there, and of course, it was spotless too. So it was incredible. But even more incredible was the difference of the countryside from one side of the fence to the other. It was mainly desert, very dry, and on the Egyptian side it was scrubby growth. Well, obviously it wasn't cultivated, and pieces of tanks and whatever, a residue from the war that nobody bothered picking up. It was scattered about. And well, on the Israeli side, there were rows and rows of fruit trees and irrigated farmland and so forth, all the way to Tel Aviv, which was a 4 or 5 hour ride. It was a long way up that coast there, but it was incredible how the Israelis were able to cultivate their ground and have it produce sustenance, whereas the Egyptians never thought of it, I guess. The difference in the political climate is totally accountable for that. So we got on the bus, and it was an 8-hour journey up to Tel Aviv on the bus. So we got there late in the afternoon, and we decided to stay at Tel Aviv overnight. So in the morning, I decided to go over to the airport and see if I could get the departure point changed. After I realized what a grueling 8-hour ride that was, I thought it'd be great if I could get the ticket changed and we wouldn't have to return to Cairo. So I went into the ticket office there at the airport, and when I gave the girl the ticket and told her what I wanted, she said, "Just a moment, please." So she went in the back room, and she came out, and a man followed her out, and I thought, boy, I was in trouble now. I'd already changed this ticket, and I thought I was going to get chastised of some sort. But anyway, he said, "Mr. Ruji, what can I do for you?" And I said, "Well, nothing much, just to change the departure point from Cairo to Tel Aviv." He said, "Would you like to come into my office?" And so Shirley and I went back, and he sat us down on his nice lounge chairs, and he said, "Mr. Ruji, I want to tell you something." He said, "If there's anything you need, just give me a call." He said, "I'm at your service. American Airlines is very happy for your service," and all this stuff. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, really. He didn't really know who I was at all, but I guess my ticket must have had some kind of a special notation or something, because he didn't do that because he loved us, that's for sure. In any case, he readily changed the ticket. That was the least he could do. So we didn't have to go back to Egypt then. And that gave us another whole day in Israel. And we didn't have a place to stay over there, but I had heard that the YWCA was a nice place. On our first trip to Israel, we had to get off the bus there at the bus station, and we walked maybe a quarter of a mile or so over to the YWCA, which was across the street from the King David Hotel. So we stayed there, and it was a very nice place. It was all made out of mortar and kind of a Arabic architecture. So it was a perfect spot. On our second trip to Israel, from the bus station we walked over to this monastery near the north gate of the old city. I don't know how I knew about it, but we walked over there. We were welcomed by a couple of nuns. Very nice place, and they had a kitchen there with a big table where the guests all came down to eat at a given time, and it was within an eighth of a mile of the old city wall, which made it very convenient. And we had a great time there. They were friendly, and of course everybody liked Shirley, so she was always popular. I made it a little habit to pick up a stone from various places that I had visited. I went down to the Wailing Wall and I put on the little Jewish hat. I can't remember the name of it now. I had to have that on to get approach the Wailing Wall. I put my hands on the wall and above my head, placed them like that. And I was just saying a prayer, and I felt underneath my left hand, it felt loose. There was a little sliver of stone loose where I put my hand, so I just casually closed my hand over it and put it in my pocket. And I looked at it later on, and it didn't have any distinguishing marks that I could see, but I knew where it came from. And those stones had been put there about 3,800 years ago. This is a shadow box that I made some years ago with my collection of rocks from all over the world. This is a famous Muslim building titled the Dome of the Rock, and it's situated on top of the platform that the Wailing Wall surrounds. We were able to get inside and look down inside the hole in the floor that purports to be the rock where Muhammad had, flew to heaven, but more earlier than that, where Jacob was offering Isaac as an offering. Oh, I did various things, so I'm not going to bore you with that. If you have an interest in Jerusalem, there's so much documentary and professional work done that's more enlightening than what I can do. But it's a holy place, and the churches there where Jesus was crucified, and of course the sorrowful passion of his walk, of the 12 stations of the cross. And, it's just endless. In the basement of the church there is the original pavement of the Roman times, and there's inscribed in the rocks a game that the Romans played with knuckle bones of a pig. One day we took a tour down to the Dead Sea in Masada. In case you're not familiar with Masada, it was the last stronghold of the Jews when the Romans sacked Jerusalem in 74 AD. The place called Masada is located along the Dead Sea. It's a plateau isolated by surrounding gullies and the water, of course, where King Herod used to go as a safety retreat and a place where he could be by himself. He built facilities there and a large cistern on top of that, and during his era of rule was a frequent visitor there. When Jerusalem was sacked by the Romans and burned to the ground in the early 70 ADs, a group of zealots and their wives and families fled to the safety of Masada. Still see the traces of the wall and the Roman encampment there. The Jews thought they were safe up there because there wasn't any access that was safe for the Roman soldiers to approach. The Romans had captured about 15,000 Jews and brought them there as slaves, and they filled in the gully between the mesa and the adjoining one. And after about a year of labor, they attacked one morning and they found that the Jews had killed themselves. And it's an interesting story, but the place had been lost for 2,000 years until about 1950, when a low-flying plane spotted some ruins on top of this plateau, and they discovered the evidence that of what had happened there 2,000 years before. The Israelis had constructed a lift up the side of the mountain so that visitors could go up to the top and see it in relative comfort. However, the day that we were there, the lift was not working, so Shirley and I climbed up the side of this mountain on this narrow path all the way to the top. And we spent a couple hours up there, and during the interim then they got the cable car fixed, so we were able to ride down. So at least we didn't have to do that. That's a very interesting place, and these pictures show some of the detail there. On this day, we went into the Jaffa Gate, which is the same as the North Gate, an older name, and the nearest gate to the monastery that we were staying. We went through the old gate entrance. Of course, it's a big archway in the wall, and we were inside the old city. And I noticed a gold chain, a very small necklace kind of thing, lying on the pavement. And so I picked it up, and it was obviously not an expensive piece, but it was a tiny little chain with some kind of a medallion on it. It wasn't worth much, but anyway, I gave it to Shirley, handed it to her, and she didn't. She wasn't. Yeah, I mean, it was something interesting something to remember the little city by, I guess. So she was looking at it. We continued to walk slowly, and a man, a middle-aged guy, husky-looking guy, came up to Shirley, and he said, "That's mine." And she said, "No, it isn't. We found it." He said, "It's mine. I want it." She said, "No, you can't have it." And so he kind of backed away, but he kept following us very closely, maybe 6, 8 feet behind. We'd go into the store or whatever, and he'd be right behind us. So that went on for maybe half an hour or 45 minutes, something. I don't remember anymore, but anyway, it began to work on Shirley's mind, and she began to get a little concerned about the safety of the whole thing. So she said, "I'm going to give it back to him." And I told her, "I don't care what you do. It's yours as far as I'm concerned. But if you want to give it back, he probably needs the money more than we do." We went on the bus up to Lake Generous, and we walked along the bank there looking for Peter's fish. Apparently there's a anecdote that St. Peter fished there and ate this certain kind of fish called St. Peter's fish. So we went in a restaurant along there, and we had a lunch with St. Peter's fish. It was probably a piece of carp that was common to the area. But anyway, like I said before, when we were in Egypt, when you're in foreign country, you act like a foreign country man and do as they do. So, but we did go to the Jordan River, which is at the point where we were at. It was kind of a tourist spot, and the bus stopped there for us, so everybody could get out and get a look at the Jordan River. It was about 4 or 5 feet wide and maybe 6 inches deep, coursing through a kind of a little swampy area along its course. Shirley had a little bottle with her, and she filled it up with Jordan River water and brought it home. I think it's probably still around. We went up to Capernaum, where St. Peter's house and the synagogue where he apparently was. The foundation exists. Went to the church there, and that's built over where St. Joseph and Mary, or legend has it that they raised Jesus. We walked down the road, down the highway, to the bottom of the valley that separates the Mount of Olives from Jerusalem, and we went in the Garden of Olives. And apparently, there are trees that are growing in there today that were growing in the time of Jesus. I didn't know all the trees lasted that long, but apparently these have, or at least that's what we were told. But there's this Mount of Olives is a rather steep hill, and so she sat down at the park bench there along the street. It's open. There aren't any houses or any buildings at least at that time, along the road leading up the side of the hill. There's a rather large cemetery on the side of that hill, as I remember. But anyway, I walked up to the top and looked out over the valley and so forth. Well, she realized that she was sitting there on a park bench in the middle of Israel without any papers. And if something had happened to me, she'd have been out of luck. She couldn't even identify herself. And we didn't think about that aspect of it when we decided how we were going to carry our papers safely. So when we got back to the monastery where we were staying that time, we made copies of her documents, and she put them in her purse, and I kept the originals. So we should have thought of that and done that before we started on our trip. The weather was cool and nice, pleasant. In fact, it was a little cool, and I hadn't brought much heavy stuff with me.
In a little store in the old city there, I saw
what he called baby camel vests and coats. So I thought I'd check and see what kind of pricing he had on those. He wanted $150 for this nice vest, but I thought it was way overpriced. Then I told him that was too much. I didn't want to pay that kind of money. So we started out of the store, and he came down $25, and I told him no. By that time I decided I didn't really want it that bad anyway. So we go out on the sidewalk, and he followed us out, and he cut the price again. He's down to 100, and I thought, well, maybe I will buy it, but we kept on walking on the way, and he kept following with that jacket, and he got down to 50, and I told him, all right, I'll take it. So I got this really nice, looks like a sheepskin sheared wool vest for $50. But it was kind of funny, and it felt pretty good too, because it got chilly in the night air. The antiquities are legitimate, are profound, because that's where our Lord lived. He saw those same mountains and many of the same streets and so forth we could see beneath old buildings and so forth. And he certainly saw part of the Wailing Wall that was still standing. But Jerusalem has been torn up and burned and destroyed so many times that very little remains authentic to the times that he lived. And so you have to take that into account when you're there. It really distracts. It distracted from my enjoyment of it, knowing that what I'm looking at is probably the 6th or 8th or more times it was reconstructed, whatever it was. So, but the fact that he did live in that country, and the climate certainly was similar, and it's a profound place to visit.
about 2,700 years ago, King Hezekiah was concerned about the water supply for the city during attacks from the various enemies surrounding Israel there. So he built this tunnel through the bedrock under the city from the upper Kidron Valley, and it exits at a spring called Gihon Spring at the lower end of the Kidron Valley in the corner of the city of King David. Anyway, they start digging from both ends, and it curves underneath the city, and incredibly they came together within a few inches of each other without well, it's an incredible coincidence or engineering feat that they were able to do that. It's a fairly long tunnel, and of course they were digging it blindly without optics. But I walked up through the entrance there, and there was about 8 or 10 inches of water still flowing through it, and I walked into it far enough to see where they had come together from both the north and the south, and they missed it about 6 or 8 inches, but you can still see the pick marks in the stone underneath there of miners that worked almost 3,000 years ago.
The other time we came through Tel Aviv in '84, it was crowded, and there was a lot of hijacking going on, a lot of flights disrupted and so forth. And Israel had suffered through the hijacking at Entebbe in Africa, and they were determined not to get ever hijacked again, and they didn't either. their security was tight, and it's tight now everywhere, but then it wasn't tight anywhere except at Israel, at Tel Aviv there, and they really did a job. This woman was ahead of us, and she was a Muslim or something. Anyway, she'd bought some seeds, fine grains of some kind of seed, poppy seeds or something, somewhere, and she was trying to take them home, and they were going through those seeds like almost one by one to make sure there wasn't anything in there that. And she was really delayed. She was getting awfully nervous, and there was another guy there with a long trench coat, and they were questioning him, and they took his trench coat, and the hem on the inside around the bottom was 2 or 3 inches wide. It turned into the inside of the trench coat, and they were feeling along the edge of that seam, and they felt something in there, and they took a sharp razor and cut the seam open and looked in there, and it was nothing but rubble from the manufacturer or something. But that guy had to get a tailor to fix his trench coat. But anyway.
So we were in Israel 5 or 6 days before we returned. We also had an experience on our first trip to Israel. Our departure date was on a Saturday, and we took the bus over to Tel Aviv on Saturday morning and went to the airport, and it was practically deserted. Saturday is an Israeli holy day, and they don't travel or do much at all. They're very strict about that. So we walked into the terminal, and there weren't any clerks there, and the counter, I think I was taking Swiss Air, I believe it was. We had decided to go to Frankfurt, Germany, and visit some friends there on our way back for a few days. And the ticket was printed that way. That was in this original scheme from the beginning. But the airline that we were supposed to take, and I believe it was Swiss Air, didn't have any flights that day at all. I was really a little perplexed because somebody made a pretty serious mistake. I stood around there and trying to determine what to do. I saw this man coming down an aisle from an office area. He was dressed in a British Airlines uniform, BOAC. I told him my situation, and he said, well, yes, we're flying to Frankfurt in about 2 hours. He said, let me take care of that for you. So we flew on to Frankfurt and stayed there with our friends for a few days. And after we left Frankfurt, we went to London. I had a mold being built there and needed to give it its final approval. But unfortunately, the builder was about 3 or 4 days late. So he invited me and Shirley to stay at their house while they finished it up. So while we were there, I'd been in London a couple times at least before that. And so I didn't have any special interest in it, but I knew that Shirley would. So while we were there, we visited London Bridge, saw its old mechanism, and we went to the Tower of London too, saw the old armor and weapons of war and the chopping block where Jane Seymour lost her head, as well as numerous others, and saw the lower cells that were totally dark and damp and small. A terrible place to be penned up. And an interesting little thing I saw there at the Tower of London. I was walking along the outside front edge of the building on the sidewalk, and I noticed a group of men in a tent attached to the wall, and men were digging a hole, and there was a pile of dirt, pretty large pile, adjacent to the place where they were working. So I walked over and I looked down in the hole, and there were 3 or 4 men down, maybe 30, 40 feet, fairly deep hole. And I could see the exposed top edge of a wall down at the bottom of the pit.
So I hollered down to them. I said, or asked them how old they thought that wall was down there. And they said, oh, I don't know, maybe 700 years or so. Not very old. It's all relative. But in any case, while I was there, I did play some mold in Ireland, and thought I'd try source there. It was a small mold, and I wasn't taking any monstrous risk with it. But as it turned out, it was late and not very well constructed. And sometime after that, I got a call from an auditing group, and they wanted to know if that representative that I had dealt with had ever visited me in the United States, and he hadn't. And I told him that, and I apparently he had claimed expenses for places he hadn't been, and apparently he had made a trip to the United States. So I guess he got into some trouble with that. But all in all, I had to go over to Brighton too. I talked to a guy there about making molds, but that didn't work out. England was, well, it was cold there. They had a little snow. So we got on the British airline BOAC to come back to the United States. And before we could depart, though, the wings of the plane had to be de-iced. So the BOAC had a de-icing machine spraying this fluid on top of the wings, but they ran out of fluid, and there was a labor issue going on at the same time. So anyway, they had to go down someplace in London or wherever to get more fluid, and they were gone about 3 hours. So when they finally returned, they started spraying, and then the spray machine broke down, and we sat there another several hours. And in the meantime, the pilots were furious at the delay. In fact, the pilot came on the intercom and said, "I don't know why anybody flies this GD airline." But anyway, they ran out of their time, so another crew had to be brought and to replace them. We were there 8 hours waiting the departure time. But anyway, we finally got off and we arrived home safely, which is all that really mattered. I think that's all it is. We'll go to the next one now.